Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And in this video, as we enter the period of 100 days until the date I think the Conservatives are aiming to hold the general election, I thought I'd take a look at the polling trends and key events which have brought us to where we are, how the Tories should have had a lot of advance warning of what was to come, but just didn't think they needed to plan. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So yes, this video is very much brought to you by the number 100. Yesterday, 100 years since the first Labour government, sort of, bit minority government-ish. And today is also 100 days until what I think is the most likely, not certain, but most likely date for the general election. It's grim to think that since there have been, 4 Labour leaders win a general election, we've had 3 Tory leaders do it in the last 8 years. But the focus is on the next few months now. As I've mentioned a lot recently, it seems to become increasingly clear that more and more Conservative MPs and shills in the media realise that the Tories are bound no matter what they do. But Tories being Tories, instead of taking stock and working out what to do, they default to their usual behaviour of simply working out who to blame. Different groups of Tories will blame different decisions or people. Johnson supporters blame Sunak. Sunak supporters blame Truss. Truss supporters insist she was right and should have been allowed to carry on. Oh, and by the way, she's really popular. The reality is that they're all responsible, and I don't just mean things happened under their leadership to land them in the position they find themselves. I mean every single one of them created the mess they are now in. Dylan Difford has produced another interesting graph, although the graph is not his this time, but the curve of best fit is. It's the voting intention poll since the last election. It draws a curve from the high point of the vaccine bounce in the first half of 2021 and the current polling position now. And what is remarkable about it is, apart from the 2 deviations, which are both downwards, the Conservative polling has followed this curve almost exactly. It really is rather remarkable. It's quite funny because I was having to try and explain to a Brexiteer on Twitter yesterday or the day before about how they couldn't just get years worth of data and draw a line somewhere on it and call it a trend. It's like, if none of the data points fit the line, it's not really a trend you're showing. But this one really follows it very, very closely. It's remarkable. Given that this curve is covering nearly 2 years worth of polling data, you don't necessarily expect a polling trend to continue for that long. But what are the 2 blips where Tory polling crashed even below the level of this downwards curve? Well, the first was under Boris Johnson. First, the Owen Paterson scandal erupted, then Partygate took over. And then it sort of recovered. There's sort of an equilibrium came back. The second was when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng took a cricket bat to people's pension funds. There were recoveries of a sort after both. Like I said, it returned to a sort of equilibrium. But that equilibrium was not to back up to the previous level, onto the declining poll rating, just following that curve. And this is because, in my opinion, the seeds of the coming disaster for the Tories were sown years ago. Now, don't get me wrong, the Tories could have turned things around after Boris Johnson. I'm not saying it was inevitable. There's nothing inevitable about this trend being continued once he was replaced. But what I would argue is this trend potentially shows that the Tories didn't fundamentally change direction on any key issues. If we forget about Truss for now, because I think most people would like to, there were things that Sunak did differently to Johnson, but not much differently. His approach to the cost of living crisis was the same, sticking plasters and doing nothing long term. His approach to collapsing public building was to do nothing. Let them fall down, hope the news doesn't talk much about it, which apart from September last year, they haven't. His approach to public sector strikes was the same. Let them strike, blame the party that sat on the opposition benches for the last 13 years. The only major departure from policy with Sunak was that he took a more pragmatic line on Brexit. But that pragmatism just stopped things getting worse, didn't actually make anything better, so the voting public didn't notice it. So because in effect all the Tories did was change the leader but not the direction, the polls carried on their direction as well, downwards. I keep mentioning that it's worth pointing out that the Tories haven't just been losing by-elections of safe seats since the scandals and cost of living crisis. They lost their first safe seat in Chesham and Amersham. Very safe seat, left vacant by the death of the sitting Conservative MP. The seat was created in 1974 and has been won by the Conservative candidate in every general election since. It remained Conservative through 2 Labour governments, never producing less than 50% of the vote for the Conservatives. A safe Tory seat in every sense of the word. Then, in that by-election of June 2021, they lost it to the Lib Dems, who had previously not even been close. Not exactly a vote of confidence in Boris Johnson, even when the national polling looks good for the Conservatives after the vaccine bounce. Johnson's supporters say that the polling was better when he was leader. Well, yes, it was as a snapshot, but the trend was the same. It's not like that trend was slightly downwards under Boris Johnson and then crashed under Rishi Sunak. You could say it crashed under Liz Truss, but not Rishi Sunak. You know, his supporters keep hailing his 2019 general election win as a strategic triumph. But what they fail to notice is they actually sowed the seeds of the decline we see here. Purely in terms of winning a large majority, the 2019 election was a strategic triumph for the Tories, although Johnson was not, of course, the brains behind it. The Conservatives were already losing some core support over Brexit, but they were able to leverage new support elsewhere. Johnson's supporters hail this new coalition of Tory voters won in 2019. Oh, we're not only winning in our normal areas, we're winning in places that were previously no-go areas, solid Labour areas. This new coalition, he'd broken politics, politics was being reformed. But it wasn't a new coalition of Tory voters, it was actually their curse. I've said before on a regular basis, 2019 was down to 3 major factors. The first was the promise of getting Brexit done and then dealing with the business of government. The Get Brexit Done slogan was not just for Brexit supporters. It was for Remainers who just wanted the deadlock to be broken. They were sick of seeing Parliament and the government arguing about this one policy while they could see that public services and just the general business of government was going neglected. They wanted it over one way or the other. Just make it stop. You know, like someone being tortured, eventually signing the confession, just make it stop. The Tories understood this at the time. It's what they based their strategy on, but they seem to forget it since. The fact that they have done nothing but fixate on Brexit ever since has effectively broken a promise to the voters that they attracted to with that slogan. Because for those who wanted Brexit, they feel betrayed that the benefits haven't arrived in their wallet. For those who wanted Parliament to shut up about it and focus on other things, the fact that the Tories keep talking about nothing else while Labour are going, we don't want to talk about it, has enraged them. Second factor was the promise of levelling up for left behind communities. This is what sort of created this so-called coalition of the Red Wall. More investment, better paid jobs. That was what they said. More investment, better paid jobs. What they got was businesses cutting jobs, sometimes going under, and the Tories urging pay restraint to control inflation while supporting record-breaking profits, executive bonuses, and at times investor dividends. The only way to retain those Red Wall voters was always going to be delivering on levelling up. But they made no serious effort at all. And indeed, even trying to do so would hurt them amongst their traditional support because they don't want to pay taxes to boost investment elsewhere. And it's all right me saying, well, if you invest in an area, then it yields a return and then that goes to the Treasury. You don't actually have to get people to pay it from their taxes. It pays for itself with the financial return. But because the Tories always claim that investment comes at a cost in taxes, those traditional Tories aren't going to buy that. They believe that if you invest in something, it costs taxes. So the Tories betrayed voters on this factor as well. And the third factor was, of course, the fear that a Labour government, especially one led by Jeremy Corbyn, would be the last days of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is odd because Tory cabinet meetings sound more like that. It's what kept those Conservatives with a small c on board, holding their nose and voting Tory, even though Boris Johnson was like the opposite of what they wanted in a Prime Minister. He was just seen as the lesser of evils. But that's gone too now. Not a Tory betrayal this time because they've got no control over who leads Labour, but Labour now have a leader who is inoffensive to most groups of voters. The Tories keep trying to play the fear factor, of course, but it's falling flat. It's just not credible. It's probably fair to say that the Tories had already come to the end of their rope in 2019. You know, during the general election campaign, there were news stories of people dumped on the floor in hospitals because not only were there not enough beds, there weren't even enough trolleys to put them on a trolley in a corridor while they waited for a bed. The collapse of our public infrastructure was established and there was photographic evidence of it. It was before Brexit, it's before COVID. The Tories had already broken the country and given up the spare parts to their mates. Under normal circumstances, that should have been it for them. They should have been ended there and then. It should have been madness for the Conservatives to want a general election in December. But because of those three key factors, they won a large majority. A remarkable general election result, which was a triumph of short-term thinking over long-term planning. Any serious Tory strategist would have known it was a one-time strategy that couldn't possibly be continued at the next election. In fact, it was a strategy which would only make it more difficult. Their only trump card was that Labour had been beaten down to almost 200 MPs and the party was as broken as Britain itself. You know, they may have imagined, as I have to admit I imagined, that the party would never repair itself so quickly. You know, they will have thought that Labour would be unelectable for another decade. So we'll win the next election, then we'll see after that. Indeed, I saw Conservative commentators say as much at the time. They just thought, well, it's going to be Conservatives now for another 10 years. This may have given the Tories a sense of arrogance that they didn't need to plan for the next election. Maybe worry about it in 8 or 9 years' time. But they were wrong. It would be interesting to know what this trend would have looked like if COVID never happened, but we can't know that. What we can see is there is now a trend line covering over 20 months of voting intention polls, which is significant, showing a very, very consistent decline in support for the Tories. A curve with a very, very tight coalition there. Correlation. It's, apart from those two crashes, which we know about, we know the reasons for those. And there's no boost. It's always a crash. There's two crashes and then back to that trend line. There's no equivalent sort of mountain to go against those valleys. It's the same trend under two different Tory leaders and prime ministers, because you can rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic all you like, but the iceberg still does its thing in the same way. And just as with the Titanic, the Tories cannot now avoid sinking. It's too late to change course. They had the opportunity to change course a couple of years ago, even a year and a half ago. They had the opportunity to change course. They didn't. So now they've struck the iceberg and it's just a case of saving as many of their people as they can. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.